My name is Jonatan Almfjord, and this is In-Depth Conversations. Okay, so for this episode of In-Depth Conversations, we have a very special guest. We welcome Axel Ekström to In-Depth Conversations. Welcome, Axel.
Thank you.
So why are you here? Well, I know that you are a PhD student, right?
Right.
Right? Yeah, you should be. So tell me, in what area?
My PhD topic is speech technology and communication. I mainly work on a few different subjects related to human speaking and human speech, mainly things like biology and anatomy and how the mechanisms of human speaking relates to mechanisms of vocal production in other species, so evolutionary perspectives on speech, and also I've also done a bit of work on how speaking systems of speech emerge in human infants, and more of a neurological perspective. So it's quite a cohesive picture, but a range of different perspectives on human speech and speech capacities.
Right. So what led you to the interest in this specific area? Did you always know that this was your end goal, so to speak? What was your academic journey so far?
It's quite a long story. I'll try to cut it down a little bit. I went into psychology originally. I did a bachelor's degree in psychology. My first plan really was to do neuroscience, or what we call biological psychology, so neurological perspectives on behavior. And that was the plan for about a year or so. I ended up doing a master's degree in cognitive science afterwards, where I dealt a lot more with perception and some with social cognition. I did a year's worth of research assistance. I worked as a paid research assistant with the neuropsychology division, where in the same university where I did my master's. And at the same time, I had an hourly assistantship with my current university, which was shut down at the time because of the pandemic, where here in Lund, where I was at the time, was not completely shut down. We still managed to do some experimental work, and they asked me to do some pretty basic experiment business, setting up some experiments, doing some basic tests. And by the time my master's degree was over and done with, they basically, my supervisor there said, you should apply to us. You should if you're interested in doing a PhD, you should do it with us, because I think you'd like it here. And I applied and I got that job, and what followed was a 6-month worth of cold showers, learning the basics of acoustics and speech production, and it was a whole different can of worms compared to almost everything that I'd been doing at the time. It took me quite a while to figure out how to sort of approach it as a neuropsychologist or a perception researcher, which is what I had thought of myself as being at the time. But once that sort of big threshold was over, then I should say it was more or less smooth sailing after that.
Right.
So yeah, it's not a very direct story. It's full of a lot of coincidences and happenstances.
Yeah. Sure. So yeah, as usual, I have a million questions. But like, if you're not visiting, like you're right now, a podcast or doing an interview with people who are like inside a academic sphere, so to speak. If you're talking to, well, not a stranger on the street, but like if you're introducing your work, or someone at the party is asking, what do you do for work, Axel? What do you say then? For perhaps there as a non-academics to be a little more, easy to understand, perhaps?
Well, most people most people tend not to think about speech as something that you need to think about because it comes so naturally and it's so deeply ingrained. You really don't have to talk about it for a whole lot before people become quite like, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Like just the sort of thing of how you produce different vowels, for instance, is mainly a question of tongue position, and people don't think about that. And so you can say that the difference between saying ooh and saying oh is actually sort of moving the tongue body up and down. And then immediately everyone who's listening to you starts doing that, and like they go,
yeah, of
and
course.
they go, oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about that. So it's quite a low bar for that sort of I guess you'd call it a party trick in a sense of people like, oh, that's quite interesting. And then if they're still interested, I can talk about after that the bar is kind of higher for if they're actually interested in listening to hearing about why the sounds that we hear in other species sound the way they do, because we sort of perceive other animals as producing vowels or something that sounds like vowels. And why is that the case, or why is that not the case? Things like that, they get a lot more tricky, and you kind of have to involve a lot more you need to involve more levels of explanations, and I suppose that's a way of separating the wheat from the chaff a little bit in terms of who is actually interested in learning more. But there tends to be a very brief or a very low bar to actually having people start thinking about, oh, well, that's an interesting sort of topic. But in my experience, the interest kind of declines after that initial after that introduction.
Yeah, I see. So what about the whole PhD thing? Did you always know that you were supposed to be a PhD, as if you will always be for life? No, but you know what I mean. How did you decide to apply for a PhD, first of all, for example?
Well, by the time I applied, I was pretty set on it. I think the critical point of making that decision was right before I finished my bachelor's, because I knew I would have a bachelor's in psychology, and the reason that I went into psychology was because I was interested in a lot of those questions. I was interested really in doing something like research, but academia can be extremely competitive, and I always, not so much anymore, but I've always been I should say slightly on the anxious side. And so I had it in the back of my mind, like, well, maybe that won't work out. Like, what are you going to do if you can't do that? And for a while I considered, I seem to be the only psychologist who actually enjoyed doing statistics, so maybe maybe I could do statistics or data science or something like that. But I figured, there's this program, the master's program that I would be interested in doing, a very, very kind of uncharacteristically you only live once moment, and I figured I'm gonna, I'll go there, I'll do that, and I'll see how far I can get with this whole thing. And I got very lucky in the end. A lot of things ended up aligning very well in terms of time. But I should say that the moment I decided to really try was at the end of the bachelor's degree.
Right.
That's when I became very kind of, okay, this is what I'm going to focus my attention on trying to achieve now.
Right.
But it wasn't without hesitation.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, before you started, got accepted, of course, what was your initial, I guess, picture of what a PhD student does? And how does it compare to what you actually are doing right now? Did it live up to your expectations or not?
Well, everyone knows what PhD students do. They do all the work for the senior professors.
Right, yeah.
No, but what you expect PhD students to be doing varies quite a bit depending on what they're actually working in. Like my field is such a niche that I really didn't have any idea about, like, to the degree that I thought it would be anything, it would be what I thought of in psychology, which is sort of, a fair bit of independence with quite a lot of insight from, or oversight from senior staff. Which is sort of, you can contrast that against someone who's doing a PhD in natural sciences, doing a lot of lab work.
Yeah.
There's a whole sort of span of how independent are you, depending on what kind of work you're doing, how much oversight is needed, or what kind of material do you need? Do you need to learn to use some kind of an equipment? All of these things kind of play into what you should be expecting. I wasn't expecting all that much, I have to say. I should say the person who employed me for the hourly assistantship is the same person who became my supervisor. So we did have a bit of contact before, so I did sort of have a way of like, okay, I know how we are sort of engaging with each other, which that kind of thing can really help you. Like some people end up in the position where they start out and they meet their supervisors on the first day, or maybe they've had a bit of email contact, but of course it's very different actually meeting someone. So there's a myriad of different little details that plays into how things can play out. Because you also asked, like, how does that actually compare to what things are like? It's well, I suppose I went into it not having all that many expectations like that specifically. I should say that maybe I hoped to have a lot of independence, and I'm happy to say that I do. That independence is part of the reason that I've been, to this point, as successful as I have, and I've managed to publish several articles under my name alone. And that's reflective of the fact that I don't always need to go to someone to ask them to let me do things, even though they often appreciate it when I do. And it's also been the biggest kind of learning experience really has been in sort of learning how to work with other people, and learning just the kind of like how you actually engage with other people that you're collaborating with. Like, for instance, with my supervisor, like we are probably more in tune now than we have ever been in the last, it's not quite 2 years yet, but 18 months or what have you. Because there's been this sort of like exchange, and there's been this sort of like, you really shouldn't do it like that. And I've said like, okay, if I ask about advice like this, what should I actually expect? There's been this sort of fine tuning over time of figuring out what you can expect, what it is reasonable, like how do you go about these things, and not just with the supervisor, but also, I collaborate with people, some people here, some people internationally. And a lot of the things that I haven't been able to sort of predict or anticipate have had to do with things like that. Like how you actually what are some best practices for really like engaging with people that you're working with. Lots and lots of details like that. But that's definitely been the things where I kind of had to learn it by being part of it.
Right.
So things like that are difficult to anticipate, I think.
Yeah, that seems reasonable actually. So I'm very interested in. Yeah, if you could like do a very, very brief example of, here's for example a project I did last week or this past year or whatever. How do you do research? As an example, I'm very curious to hear.
Well, I use a variety of different methods. Right now, working a lot with computer simulation of how our vocal tracts can be illustrated as tubes, and when we change the shape of the vocal tract by using the tongue or what have you, then we change the shape of the tube, and the sound that result changes. And I've been working a little bit on figuring out how to apply that sort of modeling, which is a very, very old way of imagining human speech. It goes back to the late 1700s. And apply that sort of modeling to non-human, we can call them speakers. But so in the case of, for instance, a paper that I had accepted at the Phonetics Congress later this year, which deals with how to study what sounds like vowels in orangutans, for instance. Because orangutans produce this sound called a long call, and it sounds very ooh, like that.
Okay.
And the thing is, when we say ooh, that backgrounded vowel, ooh, in the vowel in boot or do or things like that, we use the tongue body. We sort of arc the tongue body up toward the hard palate. And the comparative anatomy of looking at non-human great apes, looking at human speakers, as far as we know, there's no that shouldn't be possible for a non-human great ape. They don't have that degree of flexibility. There's some controversy on that area, but let's say I'm very, very unconvinced by the people who have argued that it is possible. So I started thinking, okay, well, if there's actually these limitations, then what are some ways to, because they are producing this sound, and it sounds like ooh, and if we ask people, and we did a very brief study on this, if we ask people what vowel is it, then they say that, well, it sounds like ooh. So there's something going on there that seems to me to, they're creating a sound that sounds like this, but they're probably doing it in a way that doesn't look the way we do.
Right.
So I've been trying to build a sort of way of evaluating that without having to sort of equip an orangutan with complicated measurement tools, which is problematic for a whole host of reasons.
Sure.
And what I have been able to find, and this applies to chimpanzees as well, it's just that orangutans are the one that has been published so far, is if you do have a long tube and you narrow it at the interior end, that will shift down the resonance frequencies. And that and the difference between ah and ooh is that the resonances are shifted slightly closer together, and they're shifted down.
Okay.
And it turns out that if you just assume that, well, great apes have a lot bigger and better lips than we do, so they can do that sort of kissy face protrusion better than we can. And if you build that into the model, then you actually do end up more quite close to something that looks like an ooh in terms of the sort of resulting acoustic signal. So things like that. And this is exactly the kind of thing where you realize that some people are quite interested and other people just, you kind of lose them immediately.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
For sure.
But the fact that other species produce sounds that sound a lot like something we know as one thing, but are actually reflective of something else, that I do find quite interesting.
Right.
And that's a good example of something that I've been working quite a bit on over the last year or so.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So in this case, for example, was it the case that there were already existing research on the area, and you did a continuation on it, or did you listen to a lot of I'm gonna say the wrong one, so a lot of animals, monkeys, apes, etc., and you heard this sound, and I happen to know that they shouldn't be able to make this sound. That's interesting, and then you started to pitch this proposal to your supervisor, or.
I didn't really pitch it at all. I kind of started doing it.
That's interesting.
I pitched it once I had already done it.
Okay. Cool.
Which, if you want my advice, that's how you get something funded, is by pitching what you already.
Oh, right.
When you should do it when you already have the results. It was more the second. It was more that sort of like, well, here's what I believe about what these animals look like and what their anatomy allows for, and I don't know, it's one of those things that you can really only describe if you've had a very kind of creative process. If you've worked with music, or if you've tried writing, and you kind of had this like little moment of like, oh, hang on, there's something in there. There's something that kind of lets you know that like there's something to look into here. There's an idea there. The thing about applying the tubes to it, as far as I know, no one has ever done that before.
Oh, okay.
But that's probably less reflective of my genius and more reflective of the fact that speech research has really never touched on animals before. It's a very kind of a small area. There are a couple of very big names in it, but it's not a big. That sort of comparisons of human speech to non-animal or to non-human animals. That is a very narrow part of speech science.
Right.
So part of it almost certainly has to do with that there was this like that hadn't been done before, and there was a way of, if I can show that it's possible to reach these sounds in other ways, that would lend credibility to my interpretation of this data.
Yeah.
So there's a pinch of creativity in there, pinch of, right place at the right time, certainly.
Right. So you said that, plain and simple, there isn't a lot of research, how did you say, speech research in non-humans. But like, I'm curious, what could be the reason for that? I mean, surely people must have known that animals make sounds, but is it like a distinction? No, it's a sound, it's not a speech product, or...
For two reasons. One, there is a field called bioacoustics, which deals with sounds in nature. Yeah. And those are usually the ones who study sounds, or usually the ones who study animal sounds. That's one part. That's a relatively recent field. It's become very, very big since the 80s, I should say. And a lot of that work has to do with things like, you can do animal monitoring, for instance. If you can do systems that automatically pick up on these primates, for instance, then that can help you survey the populations or where they're moving, things like that. So it has some applied use in things like conservation science. And of course, a lot of those people are really just very good at acoustics, and that's why they like doing it. The other side is that speech science, which is what is called phonetics. And phonetics is an historically extremely isolated field. It is a field that has been full of extremely talented engineering-minded people, because speaking is basically physics, or the way you need to study speaking is physics. It has to do with the transmission of sound and the imposition of narrow stricture on the tract through which the sound travels. It's not possible to study how sound is produced without being mindful of the sort of physical relationship that underlies it. And a lot of phonetics is extremely, to this day even, and even more so historically, very, very narrow. It has to do with very, very fine-grained questions of, what happens to the signal if you move the tongue in this particular way, or classic is also looking at things like how different sounds have shifted with different accents, for instance. It's very, very nitty-gritty because you study people extremely up close. And of course, and yet another reason is that phonetics has somewhat uncomfortably almost always been a part of linguistics, which really is a very surface level friendship. Well, they don't go together very well because they study completely different things. Because I don't study language. I'm not interested in language, but I am interested in speech. And those two are not the same thing.
Right.
But a result of the sort of fine-grained nature and the sort of nature of the subject itself meant that for a very long time, and still to this day, there are very few people in phonetics who are interested in the sort of wide-ranging theories, that sort of like theory of everything stuff that some exists in parts of psychology, for instance. Never really existed in phonetics. Proper evolutionary theories of phonetics really have only been presented a few times The first one wasn't until the late 60s, and that's quite late, given how central. I mean, Darwin talked about language and what language came from, but
sure.
but in the modern sense of modern speech science, people really weren't interested. And when his name was Alvin Lieberman was his name, who tried to sort of knit things together, and the response from the general phonetics community was, we don't know what speech is well enough to do this yet.
Right. Okay.
So there was immediate resistance, we don't want these grand theories, because I like to give Lieberman that credit, because it took a degree of independence to actually try and put things together. I don't think he was all that correct ultimately, but he had a point, and he definitely deserves credit for trying to put together large-scale theories of what speaking is and what speaking came from and things like that.
Right.
But generally, phonetics has been historically very uninterested in stories like that. It's becoming better now. We've worked a lot with especially perception and neuroscience and the sort of integration of what sound cues are integrated in the brain and the sort of time lapse, like how quickly certain things are integrated, certain parts of a voice signal, things like that.
Right.
But even that is still relatively new. That sort of neurophonetics. It's not really a word that people use.
Okay, sure.
So a bunch of different reasons.
Yeah,
really.
I hear you. Yeah. So when you say that phonetics has been, is it correct to say historically kind of an isolated research area? And when you say isolated, is it about less of an interdisciplinary thing? So it's less, I don't know, cooperation over.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it has to do with the nature of the beast, in a sense. Like, if you study language, the bridge to other disciplines is actually can be. I shouldn't say it is, but it can be quite straightforward. Like a lot of psychologists and a lot of linguists will find a lot of common ground.
For sure.
They'll kind of differ in terms of what parts of this phenomenon are actually interesting, and a linguist will not define language in the same way a psychologist would necessarily.
Yeah.
But they can find things to talk about, is what I'm saying. A phonetician is interested in very different questions usually, and I should say that there's obviously different parts of phonetics. Like you can study how sounds are produced, you can study the acoustic signal, and you can study how sounds are perceived. That's what's called the speech chain. Those three portions. So there's certainly a degree of breadth. And I should also make note that there has been a lot of research on the developmental side of phonetics, how speech patterns emerge in infants and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
But even there, a lot of that work has been very kind of descriptive. It's been the sort of things like phonological development is very well, it happens like this, and then it happens like this, and then it happens like this, and then you call that a theory, and that's not really a theory. It's very descriptive. So what I'm trying to get at is the phoneticians. It's both out from the outside and from the inside. I think phoneticians have been very happy to deal with these narrow things, and until recently. Yeah, I hesitate a little bit, but the basic science of phonetics is pretty settled at this point.
Okay.
We don't figure out a lot of new things about how speech is produced in some sense. There are some nuances, and people are different, and you can look at things like that. But there's not a grand mystery in how speech is produced.
Right.
So we're moving more and more towards these really complex questions of what is actually happening? Why are we perceiving speech so readily that we are? So we're kind of forced into that corner now. But even now, phonetics is often very happy to stay in phonetics.
Okay.
So and I'm putting a lot of that burden on. A lot of that onus on phonetics specifically. I think there has been a lack of interest in doing that sort of outreach, to the detriment of fields like evolution of language or what have you. The result is that a lot of people who work with language don't know a lot about how language happens, which is speaking.
Right.
And that's our fault, really. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You know what? I have to ask you. That can be the final question, actually. Since you are a speech researcher, what's the best, or I guess, what's the current working definition of the term speech? Do we know it today? You said we didn't know it, or some researchers said, "Hey, we don't even know what speech is."
Well,
do you know it today? Or
I was sort of dumbing it down a little bit. I don't think that there's really much disagreement about definitions that basic. But so maybe a better parallel would be, so there's been a couple of attempts in AI research to do things like comedy, right? To have machines that write jokes. And it doesn't turn out that well. And people tried doing it a few years ago, and then the general response from the general AI people has been, we're going to solve this once we solve this other thing. So I think maybe that's a better parallel to that. So the response to Lieberman's attempt there was really that, like, we have more work to do before we get into these things.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, so I think the response was more that he was being sort of precocious, or he was sort of moving ahead of the curve a little too much, or something like that.
Okay.
But speech is pretty straightforwardly defined. Although people will always find ways to bicker, but they're bickering because they're really detail-oriented people, because they're engineers, so they love picking apart details.
Okay, I hear you.
Yeah.
Just finally, if an animal makes a sound, what makes it? I don't know if that's the term you used, but like a sound produced by an animal or animal speech, or can you use those terms at all?
No. I wouldn't call it speech. Speech is this thing that you and I are doing.
Okay.
It's a very kind of it's a very culturated behavior. And while we're on it, like, I wouldn't call Polly wants a cracker, a parrot doing that. I don't think that's speaking either. I see. I think that's vocal repetition.
Right.
And to sort of apply it as well, if you have a computer and you program the computer to synthesize a voice signal, and the computer says, "Hello, how are you?" I don't think the computer is speaking either. The computer is producing something that we perceive as speaking. Or that we perceive as speech. It produces a signal that we perceive as speech or speech-like, but it isn't speaking. Speaking is this. Speaking happens inside the speaker.
All right.
And
it's not happening. Between two speakers. Can you talk to yourself at home, and you would call that speech?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I do that all the time.
Yeah, sure. Me too.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, super interesting. I don't think we have much time left, so thank you very much, Axel, for visiting In-Depth Conversations.
Yes, thank you.